Good morning, X Winterview, back again, driving to work again, with another brief dialogue, again, for his dear friend, Annastacey. This brief dialogue is on Paul MacLean's triune brain model. I thought I would talk about this morning for any spiritual seekers, for anyone who's feeling they don't like their own humanity at times, for seekers who experience excessive guilt and shame and anxiety about that. This is that kind of dialogue. And also to partial out, I guess, the wheat from the chaff in this so-called endeavour to realise the truth of one's eternal nature. The triune brain model was proposed, I believe, I could be wrong, back in the, was it 60s? Might even be more recent, could have been the 90s. Paul MacLean was a neurologist, and the model was kind of in vogue for a while and has fallen out of vogue. And people have pointed out all these big holes in the model. Doesn't work, not true, blah blah blah. But it's a great model for understanding some of the fundamentals of your human existence, your existence as a forest creature that now wears fancy suits. Broadly speaking, the triune brain is the three-brain model. Cross-sectionally, looking at the brain, there are three distinct regions. Well, I wouldn't say distinct, you have to have a keen eye, but more or less you can determine these. They are the innermost layer of the brain, or the core of the brain, the so-called reptilian, or R reticulans, I think it is. Not good with my terminology. Terrible memory. Call it the reptilian brain. The next layer moving outwards, the midbrain section, also referred to as the mammalian brain, or the emotional, or the limbic brain. And finally, the cauliflower regions of the outer brain, of the cortex / neocortex, the so-called thinking, rational, maybe even brain. The theory goes a little like this, that evolution of the human, like any other animal in a sense, was developed over millennia. We won't get into the dates and times necessarily, but let's say a freaking long time. And adaptation to one's environment is often conceptualized in modern times as improvements on. But it's not necessarily the case. An improvement on is a needless, I would say, anthropomorphization. Did I pull that word off? I hope I did. Of some sense of we're improving all the time. The humans are improving. And it sets up a kind of subtle yet powerfully pervasive sense of, I think, superiority of some kind. Or a way of looking back at the past and saying they were so primitive and we are so much more evolved, which is not the case. The basic premise of adaptation is that if, for example, the environment changes in some way, the creatures or the species who can best adapt to that environment at the fastest rate, you might even add, will be the ones most likely to survive that environment. So you could end up with characteristics and traits that are quite unusual depending on the environment. So if, for example, let's just choose a crazy example, why not? Let's say that there was some strange gas explosion from the innermost core of the Earth, like a volcano type of deal. And as part of the eruption, there was a huge release of sulfur gas, which is that rotten egg smell gas. And now the world is full of this sulfury yuck gas. Like, just let's say that's saturated in sulfur. There might be those amongst us who have, from some genetic quirk, a way of coping with a high sulfur content in the atmosphere. Whereas there might be others who find it so distressing, or their system and their body finds it so terrible that they can't survive very long in that environment. So all the sulfur adapted people are more likely to survive and procreate and breed and pass on their genetics. And so we end up with this species of sulfur survivors, that kind of thing. But then maybe there's a shift again, different type of atmosphere, and all the sulfur people die off to give rise to a new dominance. So that's kind of the nutshell version of adaptation. So the theory of the three-brain model goes a little like this. The core survival requirements of the organism, and you could extrapolate this to most mammals or animals, are the basics: the breathing, the heartbeat, respiration, heartbeat, food, mating, nesting even, you could say. I think I've got them all. Fighting for survival if needed with other predators, eating, etc. All that. All the basics. Absolute basics. Metabolism, that's the word. And so you could say that the core functions of the brain, and this is now pointing down at the innermost core of the brain, were adapted for our basic survival requirements. And interestingly too, that the basic survival requirements, breathing, respiration, metabolism, vascular, blah blah blah, are all in the deepest parts of the brain, and so in a sense are protected more so than the outer layers. So that suggests an adaptive cleverness there too, that put the most valuable stuff hidden deep in the brain to protect from injury or disease, if that's possible. Then we have a secondary, this mammalian layer of the brain, which, because we're not just physical survivors, we're social survivors. We live in groups more often than not, so we have a so-called social requirement for our survival. And this is the story of the mammalian, the midbrain. This is the emotional brain. So it pays, so to speak, in the mammalian world to understand emotions, etc., in order to relate to others, to better understand and communicate with, to feel connected to, or to feel apart from, in some cases, others. This is our social brain, midbrain. Now, the final so-called layer, you could divide the cortex into possibly the neocortex as well, adding on that extra clever little frontal bit of the brain. But let's just talk in broad brushstrokes. Why not? Is the thinking part, the so-called reasoning, abstracting part of the brain. This is the part that, in theory, you could say, differentiates humans from their primate cousins, in that the primates also have a cortical mass, just not as evolved as the human. This is the reasoning, so-called reasoning part of the the brain and has the brilliance that we come to think of humans as being brilliant. This is where the brilliance is. The abstraction is really, in particular, the most brilliant part. Language, abstraction, etc. And this is, let's say, a story of tool making, the story of cleverness with tools, cleverness with creating things to enhance survival. So the so-called plains-dwelling human or creature, forest creature, running around after game with its bare hands. At some point it occurs to pick up a rock, perhaps, and hurl the rock at the prey rather than running around like a mad thing chasing your dinner every night. And that is a little bit more efficient. And then because we're clever, we enhance that even further. Projectiles of all description, perhaps spears, and later bows and arrows. And you know the story. History. And now look what we've done. The iPhone, that's where we've landed. We've landed on the iPhone. It doesn't get better than the iPhone in present day society. Okay, there are other things that are better than the iPhone, but you know what I'm saying. Now this is where it all gets a bit funny now, because the quest for spirituality, the quest for enlightenment, the quest indeed just to feel better, is often mixed and muddled up in ideas of this human organism improving somehow, becoming better. And we have all this mythology wrapped up in, especially in religion, about the sort of grandness of the human, the ability to be loving and transcend petty woe and become amazing, and that the human has a special destiny, that I have this path, this special place in the world that is mine. I am a special cog in the machinery of the humankind, and I will one day achieve my inner purpose, you might say. These are all wonderful fantasy fairy tales, and indeed the quest for liberation is usually built into this style of thinking, that when I transcend my yucky, mucky humanness, I will become this being of light and love that will radiate lovingness unto the world, and I will feel bliss and peace and all that. I made up a new word, bliss. Better than peace, I suppose, combining peace and bliss. So then we engage in this quest for liberation, and we meditate, and we change our diet, and we try to be really nice to everyone. But we forget that this creature, this body that we take to be us, to be I, to be the core of I, is little more than a very clever animal. Little more than a very clever animal. This creature, this seemingly benign creature full of love and light and special purpose, at its core can still, if the conditions are right, be a raging psychopathic killer. Very, very quickly you might be shocked to discover. Let us consider the following scenario. The prime directive, you might say, of the core innermost brain is to survive at all costs. I mean, we don't just lie down and take it. We fight for our survival. And you would find this out very easily in a break and enter scenario where a criminal is breaking into your house and threatening you and or your family with violence or death or whatever. You will find that your rational, logical, loving human brain is not your friend in that scenario, nor necessarily is your emotional brain, which will get all quivery and blubby. Your best friend in this scenario could indeed be your survival brain, your kill or be killed brain. Suddenly, this middle class, gentle soul that you thought you were is forced into a situation where you might end up having to club someone to death in order to survive a terrible situation. A terrible situation. And then perhaps afterwards, if you're trying to justify it to yourself, you can't quite make sense of it. You thought of yourself as this wonderful, loving, gentle human who just did this horrific act upon another human in self-defense, forgetting that the core part of the brain is hardwired for this particular behavior. There's another example we can go to, the good old-fashioned, the good old drunk at the Christmas party scenario. For those of you who've worked in offices that have very cheesy end-of-year Christmas parties where the booze flows and there's lots of people and it gets a bit silly and someone does something they regret. The person that, you sleep with the boss, you sleep with the secretary, you say something inappropriate that you've always wanted to say after a few drinks to the whole room, shocking them all those funny little scenarios. This is the mammalian, this is the emotional brain in action, doing its thing. So when the alcohol disinhibits some of the higher cortical functions of reason and logic, switches them off for the night. We don't need reason and logic, we're drinking tonight. Out come the emotions, and you know this if you had a few drinks. You become happy, high, giddy, silly initially, and then you can become sad and teary, and then angry, and then back to happy, all in an hour. It's great fun, isn't it? And then we regret that the next day. We why did I do that? Oh, I'm so silly. But we're only regretting it when the higher outer brain, when the higher cortical reasoning, critical evaluative part of the brain comes back online. It's like, what have you done, midbrain? What did you do? Oh no. But the midbrain was doing exactly what it was designed to do. And also, interestingly, taking sort of more prime directives from the lower brain too. This is part of the triune brain theory. The so-called, let's say, triune brain, let's say the reptilian brain's directive is to procreate. It doesn't have any feelings about the matter. It's just, we've got to do it. And then the emotional brain sort of comes in with the added emotions. Oh, I've got to be nice, I've got to be gentle, loving, kind, But really, it's about sex, the base brain's directive. And so the pair of them together, without the critical thinking part of the brain, become a bit flirty after a few drinks. And you know what happens next. So there's a forgetting too that the mammalian brain has a kind of agenda of sorts, a way of communicating, a way of being in the world. And finally we have this cortical, this outer cortical thinking, rational reasoning part, which when the lower two parts of the brain are all chilled out and relaxed, etc., and everything's functioning more or less okay, got all my primal needs met and everything's okay, we find access to the outer regions of the brain much more easy. We become a bit smarter, a bit more intelligent, etc. And one of the downsides of the outer part of the brain is it tends to skew reality somewhat too. We imagine life is like this, life is reasonable, life is rational, life is organized, etc., etc. So we can get mind blind. And we can also get mind blind from the lower two levels. We can think that life is all about fighting and battling and and all that. It's not about any of them in particular. It's sort of it's whatever's happening really, based on the circumstances, you could even say. So for those out there who are somehow looking to improve the human, I'd just forget it. Just forget it. Really. This human thing has nothing to do with liberation / enlightenment. Nothing at all to do with it. It will do what it needs to do. This body will do what it needs to do to survive the environment that it's in. It can be rational when it needs to be, clever, creative. It can be emotional, can throw sulks really easily, pout and have tantrums, yell and have anger. It can be seductive, flirty, sad, woe is me, poor me. It can be cool, calculating, brutal. It can be matter-of-fact, straight to the point, etc. The body will do exactly what it is designed to do, given the circumstance, given the situation. That is for survival. So forget all these glorious ideas of liberation for the body, or the lovingness of the human who has got the spiritual whatever in its heart. It's all needless waffle. Think of it as an animal, a very clever animal, an amazing animal if you like, but an animal nonetheless that needs a lot of compassion too, in that sense that it's very difficult. It's not easy to be a human. There's a lot of complexity in the behavior that's poorly understood, and especially when you start adding spirituality into the mix, it can become a great formula, a recipe for guilt. Why aren't I behaving better? Why aren't I always perfect and loving and kind and gentle and reasonable and rational and amazing? Why am I not all those things all the time? It's a easy way to deny humanity. Spirituality is a very easy way to deny humanity, and of course that does nothing but bring up guilt and shame. I shouldn't be this way. Why am I this way? There are so many factors playing in to human behavior, it can blow your mind. The worst model for human behavior, as I've said before, is the model of the self. The idea that there's a person inside directing behavior that completely ignores the multitude of factors that are influencing and impacting apparent behavior at any given moment. So throw that model away, yo. This is a very, very complex organism, very primitive, with incredible experiences that have gone for millennia, that have led to the current adaptation for survival. Your body will play this out as it needs to, whether that's being angry at times, brutal at times, loving, clever, etc., etc. It knows what to do, and it will definitely, mark my words, be doing it. Anyway, that's the end of this brief dialogue. Arriving at work, got to get my game face on, getting ready to be smart and amazing, because that's what's expected of me. I just don't feel like it though. I want to be dumb and lazy and petty and whiny and have a little tantrum. Maybe I'll do that today. Once again, thanks for listening. As usual, your comments are very welcome.